I wanted to start by saying that one of the things that really informs this work for me is the knowledge that when my parents got married in the very early 1970s, their interracial marriage, which was also an interfaith marriage, had only been legal throughout the country for about 5 years, right? So when we think about what is going on in this moment, right, there's a lot has changed in a very short amount of time. Right? Loving versus Virginia is still very much a recent part of people's lives. And interracial marriage is different in some ways than interfaith marriage. And as Adam noted, we'll talk a little bit about terminology in a bit. But I think that for those of you who have found a community that really affirms who you are and how you want to go about things, that you may or may not realize how unusual that is. And I just also wanted to add, like, as an adult convert to Judaism who grew up in a UU context, your service has just been a lovely, like, sort of blending of the heritage that I have and the world that I've chosen for myself. And so I've really appreciated being with you. So let's start with this kind of crazy term, Chrismukkah, which got its start. The term Chrismukkah was first used on the OC in 2003, 2004. And in 2004, it was the Time Magazine Word of the Year. And Chrismukkah is not the thing that you see in the world of most interfaith families. Chrismukkah is this sort of media phenomenon in which the argument is you've got 8 days of presents and then 1 day of lots of presents. Right? Like that's kind of the idea behind Chrismukkah. And the idea is that it's basically a consumer frenzy. The idea is not that you might have a meaningful engagement with one or both of the traditions involved, right? It's like a capitalist excess idea. I'm going to say right now, basically nobody that I studied did this. Nobody. And I studied people who do both. And I studied people who have affiliated with Judaism and maintain some level of sort of Christian custom in their home, often specifically the celebration of sort of a post-Christian Christmas, a secular American Christmas. I talked to a few people who have chosen Christianity and just couldn't find enough of them to like actually write about them in a meaningful and substantive way. But nobody actually does this. People joke about it a lot though. And there is this assumption that interfaith families are sort of an active part of the community. So you all may remember airplanes as something that we got on once upon a time. And if you remember airplanes, you might remember that, about 5 years ago, they got rid of the Sky Mall magazine. But I, every year for about 15 years, have gone to a conference the weekend before Thanksgiving and another conference in mid-December. So I spent a lot of time during the holiday season on airplanes, and Sky Mall used to advertise this Star of David Christmas tree topper. So I figure this is how you know you've got a phenomenon on your hands. It's worth trying to sell something to random people on airplanes. Like that seems like a good bet. That means you've got a cultural phenomenon on your hands. Now, I was at a panel the other day at the Association for Jewish Studies in which my phenomenal colleague, Jessica Cooperman, was talking about seders in Christian churches. So I'm not going to swear that there aren't sort of supersessionist Christians who want these for their trees. But if you look at it, it specifically says that it is a must-have for interfaith marriages. So we've got this kind of documentation of this phenomenon. What then do people actually do? This is a picture book for little kids, and it's from Scholastic. So think about book fairs in elementary school. One of what's going on that you can't quite see is that my cat is walking around on my keyboard and is advancing my slides. Which he learned to do in part to get attention from my students while I was teaching this semester. But what you see here, this is sort of from the school of thought of doing both. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about Chrismukkah as a cultural phenomenon in a moment. But this, like all children's books, is sort of intended to give a message to little kids about what is possible and to normalize the life they're leading. And so this is a book that is saying you could absolutely celebrate both. These are both midwinter festivals of lights. And this is sort of a heartwarming story about a little kid who has wonderful and meaningful family time with both sides of her family, right? There's a small body of literature like this, and to be honest with you, it runs sort of counter to most of what you would see from a group like PJ Library. Those of you who have kids or have grandkids might know PJ Library. I have a friend who studies PJ Library, and she's really like endlessly frustrated by it because it's modeled on Dolly Parton sending books to children who could not afford books. And PJ Library, generally speaking, has a pretty solidly middle class and upper middle class recipient base. But it is a program that is designed to send Jewish content books into Jewish homes, but also interfaith homes to encourage these families to make Jewish journeys and Jewish choices on their like Jewish journeys. So they, for instance, have a book, there's a book called The Queen of the Hanukkah Dosas, and it's about a Jewish, presumably Hindu, but Jewish South Indian family that is making dosas for Hanukkah, but you have no sense, like I don't actually know that they're a Hindu family, right? They're a Jewish family doing Jewish things with some Indian food. That is the multicultural message that PJ Library will send out. This is the counter book. This is saying it's okay to do both. You're not going to be confused. You're not going to be unhappy. You can have beautiful family time. Now, part of what's here, though, is this is like Christmas with Christmas trees and pretty lights. It's not Christmas with like Jesus Christ the Savior. And it's Hanukkah, again, with family time and the fun of the dreidel and the menorah. It's not like a story about resisting assimilation and killing people. And it's not even really a story about the miracle of oil that lasts for a really long time, right? Like it's pulling out some of the cultural particularity and it's playing up the universalism. Now, I'm not telling you that because I think that's a bad thing. I'm just sort of flagging for you that that's one of the ways that people choose to blend and negotiate things. And I'm going to ask you to kind of put a pin in the Hanukkah dosas story because I'm going to come back to that at the very end. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how that image differs from this Chrismukkah idea that I think gets kind of held up as really problematic, and it's what people assume is going on. And I want to talk about it because Quincy, sorry. Because what you have is far more of this sort of assumption of this like kitschy thing going on. And I want to kind of dispel that notion because, as I said, this is the kind of book that people keep in their bathrooms, right? Like it's not even really a coffee table book. And it's written by a man in an interfaith marriage, and neither member of the couple is particularly religious for a particular definition of religion that I think, how should I put this, is maybe not fair to communities like yours or to the Unitarian communities that I grew up in, which are deeply ethical, thoughtful communities that are maybe not conventionally religious in the way that, like, you know, the Catholic Church or the conservative movement think of religion, right? And so in this book, you see things like this. This is the Passion of the Iced. And this is a drink for a Long Island iced tea. It's got this like Long Island Jews joke to it. It's got a Passion of the Christ Holy Week to it. It's targeted at Christmas and Hanukkah, even though the Passion of the Christ is associated with Easter. And it's unconcerned about the fact that the Passion of the Christ, which appears largely in the book of John, is the source of, and the liturgy that is associated with Holy Week, is the source of a massive amount of anti-Semitic violence throughout European history, right? So there's an irreverence to other people's deeply held faith. There's sort of a failure to account for which holiday is which, and there's sort of a historical blind spot about what these things have meant. And this is the kind of thing that gets held up as sort of what people who do both are doing, and the idea that they would be okay with this. And whether or not you're okay with this, right? Whether or not you see this as like sardonic humor in like a, I don't know, The Onion or something like that style, or whether you find this offensive, is a different question, and one that people are entitled to. But this is the thing that I think kind of gets the ire of people when they think about people who are doing both. They're not thinking about those pretty children's books about wonderful family time. They're thinking about things like this. And they're not, again, I wanted to have this, I've got like just a couple of holiday cards to have up while I'm talking to you about what I saw in the families that I studied instead. So I saw people who were deeply committed to Jewish life for a variety of definitions of Jewish life, ranging from almost sort of purely secular up through sort of, we would be members of the conservative movement, except they're so nasty about our families that we're not there, but we're like relatively observant members of Reconstructionist or Reform congregations. But we're celebrating Christmas, and we're celebrating Christmas because the parent from a Christian tradition has really gone all in with this Jewish life, and this is the one thing that they've asked to keep. So I talked to people who felt really strongly about that, and I talked to people who felt that way and who had, in which the Jewish partner had learned to really love Christmas. And I talked to my favorite example comes from a family that I became very close to over the time that I studied them, and they're a Black Ashkenazi family. So the mom and the couple, it's a straight couple, and the wife and mother is an Ashkenazi Jew from Massachusetts, and the husband in the couple is a former Pentecostal sort of independent church, kind of Baptist Pentecostal hybrid, South Georgia hog farmer family. And, you know, she said that particularly in years that Hanukkah falls early, it actually is really hard for her to put away Hanukkah and have it be all Christmas all the time in her house. But it's really important to her to remember that her husband like lets her clean the kitchen for Passover, and in fact doesn't let her do it, but rather pulls the refrigerator out and scrubs it down because it matters to her, right? That he has been really happy to have them be members of a synagogue, despite the fact that he has, having grown up in a fairly conservative religious tradition, like basically wants nothing to do with it. And this is something she can give him, right? So I saw that in families that were primarily affiliated with Judaism. I spoke with Unitarian Universalist families where they're really keeping a dual liturgical calendar, but have reinscribed the meanings of all of the holidays to fit with a fairly consistent Unitarian Universalist message. So Hanukkah becomes about persistence through the ages. Christmas becomes about peace on earth, goodwill towards humanity. Easter becomes about renewal and rebirth, and Passover becomes fighting for justice for yourself and for others, right? So they've got a cohesive message that floats through all of the holidays. And in some of the congregations, there are also high holiday observances, again, fit to UU messages and values. I spoke to families that are actively engaged in doing both. So the primary family that I talked to there is the Miller family, and Sue Katz Miller does a huge amount of advocacy work, and she was good enough to get her entire community to speak to me as I was doing this research. And in those communities, they celebrate both holidays, and the children know both sets of stories. They understand them largely as metaphors, very much the way that liberal Jews and Unitarian Universalists and sort of the most liberal end of the Protestant main line think of these stories. But again, it's not sort of a kitschy, let's do it all at once. They're kept separate. The stories are known, and meaningful celebrations ensue. I also actually talked to people who are more interested in being immersed in two different religious communities. And again, they tended to not want to make strong truth claims, but to want their children to be really rooted in both sets of communities. The couple that I write about in my book are actually a Mormon Jewish couple. And it was my dissertation, so the entire thing was like 10 years, right, between when I started the research and when the book hit the press, the shelves. So like the kids kind of grew up during that time, and they didn't know what was going to happen when I interviewed them. And as I was writing the book, I have this long email about one of the daughters being told by the Mormon church that you can't be both. And so that was the moment when she made a choice. And she chose Judaism. And the parents, including the Mormon feminist mom, said that they had known all along that that was what was going to happen because they were trying to raise feminists. And they knew that Judaism had more space for radical feminism than Mormonism had. And the mom was trying to create a Mormonism that her girls could belong to, but she knew that she wasn't going to do it fast enough, right? That her girls were going to be Jews. And so you see all of these different ways that people do things. And what I'm hoping we'll be able to talk about some is why they make those choices. Because I really think it's important to me as a researcher to say, like, regardless of the choices that I've made in my life, regardless of like the choices that if I don't have children, but like regardless of the choices that I would dream of my children making, what's important is to understand why people make the choices that they make and what's important to them. Right? Like, I don't think any of these choices are bad. And I think it's important that we note that none of these choices result in children who are like deeply damaged, or at least not any more damaged than anyone else grows up to be. And so I kind of wanted to put that out there. And I'm also happy and excited to hear about the stories that exist in your family. And I promise I'm done writing about this. I probably have one more article about this in me. And so your stories will not end up in print, but I do want to turn to that one more article that I have in me, because I promised Adam that I would talk a little bit, maybe particularly in light of Kamala Harris, but also just because I think it's an interesting place where we've thought less, and it's just going to cycle through, right? Like, this is the last picture. I mean, I've got some blank slides, but I'm going to stop sharing. You saw Lenny Kravitz, and this is a book called My Basmati Bat Mitzvah. I want to kind of close, and I'm kind of tired of fighting with my cat in the slides. And I wanted to close by basically saying that one of the most interesting things that I found is that the space that Jewish communities, and again, I suspect that your community is atypical here in terms of the sort of broader picture of the people who I studied, made more room for including the non-Jewish traditions, Christianity, but also Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam, and in particular Hinduism and Buddhism, for people of color than they did for white non-Jewish people. In an Ashkenazi community, if the Christian or post-Christian spouse is white, you can create a family that will seamlessly blend into Jewish community. If it's an Ashkenazi, more or less, right? Like, within a couple of generations, no one will ever know, is sort of the theory here, right? Like, they'll blend in. If what you've done is, if it's an Ashkenazi community and the Christian or post-Christian spouse or the Hindu spouse or the Buddhist spouse is not white, you have a family that sort of is going to look different in Jewish community. That's kind of the assumption. Now, it's also not necessarily true because of adoption, right? But that's kind of the operating assumption going on. And as a result, those families get policed differently. And we can talk a little bit about why, but part of it is that a huge amount of the logic for demanding that Christians entering Jewish entering into interfaith marriage, sort of let Judaism be the primary tradition, is because of the minority status of American Judaism, right? And no self-respecting Jewish liberal is going to look somebody Black in the eye and claim exclusive minority status. It's not going to happen. And so you end up with a very different power dynamic and a very different conversation. So it's partly, you can't assimilate these people fully anyway, because they're going to look different. And it's partly a political thing, right? It's partly about having two minority traditions in play, or two minority identities in play, rather than a minority standing up to a majority. So I tossed a huge amount of stuff out there. I did it really quickly because Adam and I had this like 3-hour-long roving conversation when we planned this, and I wanted to give him lots of hooks for the questions that we would ask. And so I put a huge amount out there. I did it fast. I did it well. I had this, sort of set of just kind of pretty pictures in the background. I'm going to hand it over and we can start having a conversation. And my sense is it's going to start out just you and me and then open up to everybody. Is that the plan?
Yeah, that should work. I actually wanted to start with something you'd referred to earlier on when you referred to the, quote, nasty conservative movement, or at least the conservative movement's nasty approach to interfaith families.
And, well, and in all fairness, that's a quote. I try as a scholar to not label.
Yes. Look, I'm both a scholar and a rabbi, and sometimes I can say what people do is not nice. I mean, there was a document that the conservative movement put out in the 90s that referred to intermarriage like it was a drug addiction. It was called Let's Talk About It. Let's not sweep this under the rug. Let's talk about this problem, and let's try to prevent it as much as possible. And let's try to treat it, if necessary, with conversion, and then only then we can get to acceptance. This is 25 years ago. This is not, back in the dark ages. But now, in 2020, the conservative movement hired a woman named Karen McGinnity, who's a professor at Hebrew College in Boston, who's written a couple of wonderful books on the gendered experience of intermarriage, as a consultant to the United Synagogue to try to make them more welcoming to interfaith families. And the Reform movement, which for years had statements against intermarriage, even if they welcomed the children of intermarriage, and there was a sort of, a split personality on that. Now they're interested in radical hospitality. And one of their flagship rabbis, Angela Buchdahl, at a congregation in New York, gave a very wonderful, warm, and welcoming speech for people of all heritages to feel connected to Judaism as a religion, as the Reform movement presents it. And now the Reconstructionists are accepting intermarried rabbinic students. So, the world is very different now than it was 25, 30, 40 years ago. And at the end of the book, you do point this out in your conclusion where you say, we don't really know what the effects of these more open and welcoming and inclusive environments are going to be. We know what happens when you push people away. We've seen the results of that. But I'm curious to ask you, playing prophet maybe a little bit, will it work or is it too late? I mean, are people too used to not being members anywhere, having their friends do weddings, not feeling a need to be part of a community, especially for the children of intermarriage who weren't welcome anyways? Are they really going to want to go back to communities that would have rejected their parents? So is it too late or can we still right the ship?
I mean, I think that there are some other social factors that are worth considering. When I first started this research, I had a conversation with a chaplain at the College of Worcester in Ohio, and she was the Protestant chaplain. And I didn't actually end up following this research thread, but one of the things that she said she had discovered is that when students came to college, sort of because of the appeal of multiculturalism, like if they were interested in exploring a religion, and she was certainly, and coming from a Protestant context, she's going to frame them as religious identities, right? But also, like, if she encountered the students, that was how the students were framing it. Really liberal Protestantism doesn't actually look that different from like being American. It's not super exciting. You don't get new things to learn. You don't get a cool culture to explore. She was like, I cannot compete with the rabbi. Like, I just can't. And it was funny because she wasn't really interested in competing with the rabbi. Like, they were mostly interested in, they were sort of, it was like they were, worked really closely together. They got along. She didn't really care one way or the other about not competing with the rabbi. But her observation was in this moment when multiculturalism and having things that like were made you different, but were utterly acceptable, in that historical moment, Judaism was winning if people were interested. Is that the case now? I don't know, right? Like in a moment of real rising anti-Semitism. Another question is, in a moment of rising anti-Semitism, can you choose to not be Jewish? And if you can't choose to not be Jewish, is that so you can't get away from it anyway? Will that make being part of a community more appealing to people? I think another question, and this is real speculation, and in some ways it's tied to the pandemic. We're increasingly, I mean, there is that argument that we're like a bowling alone society now, right? That we're not joiners, we do things really individually. Are people happy that way? And if they're not happy that way, how will the pandemic play into that, right? A synagogue community, a church community, a like book group with a long-standing membership, a bowling league, you check in on each other in a more organized way than a friend group necessarily is going to, right? There's sort of a structure. Is this social experience going to make people go back to that? And I say this sort of, it turns out that the decade of American life that had the highest rate of church and synagogue attendance, and I say church and synagogue because we did not have like a gigantic Muslim population, is the 1950s. People weren't really going to church or synagogue during the Great Depression. They didn't have money to pay synagogue membership dues. Churches tend to have canvassing campaigns that would be embarrassing during the Great Depression. They didn't go. They didn't have like nice clothes to wear on Friday night, Saturday morning, Sunday morning. Like they just didn't.
Well, I often wonder if are we just reverting back to the mean of a third of people being part of religious communities and other people dropping in occasionally, and most people just doing their own thing, and religion becomes a less important part of their lives. It's not that they're anti-religious, they're just not so interested in it.
Well, and I think that kind of what I'm saying is there have been cyclical moments, right? So it jumps up after the 1950s or after the 1940s, after World War II, it jumps up. Will it jump up again after the pandemic? Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't really jump up after the Spanish flu, which Spain would like me to point out comes from Kansas, right?
Yes. The other interesting topic related to this is, the broader secularization of American society has certainly impacted Jews. You see it in the rise of the nuns, people who don't identify with any particular religious tradition. There's a parallel in millennials, both in the general population and in the Jewish specific population. And one thing you talk about in the book, and I think it's a really important point for humanistic Judaism in general, but also specifically for interfaith families, is this distinction between religion and culture.
Mm-hmm.
With people defining certain pieces of identity as religion and certain pieces as culture. And sometimes calling it culture makes it less important than religion. Sometimes calling it culture makes them more attached to it because they're sort of spiritual but not religious, with religion as the negative term. Some of it's the freedom to choose that they like out of the name culture. And some of it is sort of defensive, justifying the fact that they're only doing some and picking and choosing. So I'm curious for you to talk a little bit more about that dynamic of calling something religion versus calling it culture and how people are using that.
So I think you outlined it really nicely. I think the important thing to remember is that religion and culture are both, so there are sort of two ways to think about this. One is that the way that scholars use the terms religion and culture are really different a lot of the time from how we use them out in the world when we're talking, right? So there are like cultural anthropologists have ways of defining culture. And in religious studies, we have a ton of definitions of religion. And often as you set out to do a piece of scholarship in religious studies, you like pick the definition that you're going to use and you pick it based on kind of the work that you're interested in doing. My favorite scholarly definition of religion right now is a network of, it comes from Bob Orsi, who is a professor at Northwestern. And he's sort of the sort of most important living Catholic religious history scholar. And he talks about religion as a network of relationships between heaven and earth and the living and the dead. So it's all of the things that you do to conjure these relationships between potentially the divine world and the earthly world, but also like the dead as they exist in your memory. And he's talking a lot about Catholicism and saints, but you could use that idea really interestingly if you think about the way that the Holocaust lives in Jewish memory, right? So there's that. In terms of how we sort of people, right, use religion and culture, we don't use those terms stably either. And in the book, I write about this using the Christmas tree. So in like the 1970s, the reform movement is fighting hugely about whether or not it's okay to perform interfaith marriages. And by the end of the 1970s, Alexander Schindler, who is in charge of like one wing of the reform movement, decides to do a lot of outreach to interfaith families. It's still not basically okay for rabbis to be performing these marriages. Then they try to forbid the rabbinate to perform interfaith marriages. And they don't. They end up allowing it, but not because they think interfaith marriages are good things, but because they believe in the autonomy of the pulpit.
What they do is they tell the rabbi, you shouldn't do it, but there's no penalty if you do. That's the way they got around it.
And what rabbis tend to say is you have to have a Jewish home. But it's the reform movement in the 1980s. So what makes you a Jewish home is that you're not doing Christian things, except that it's the reform movement in the 1980s. So like 40% of them do have Christmas trees, but interfaith families can't have Christmas trees. That becomes like the thing that makes you a Jewish home. Not that you're doing anything in particular Jewish, like, I don't know, watching, I guess Seinfeld isn't around yet, but like you're not lighting Shabbat candles, you're not joining a synagogue necessarily, you're not having a Christmas tree, right? Why? Because the Christmas tree is a religious symbol. Fast forward 5 years, and you've got books by people like Paul Cowan, who is the author of sort of the, if you will, the Bible for how to do interfaith marriage for the 1980s and early 90s, who says the reason, so you can't have a Christmas tree because it's a religious symbol, but the reason it's okay to ask a Christian person to give up their Christmas tree is that it's a cultural symbol. It's not integral to their Christianity. Baptism is what's integral to their Christianity. So like giving up a tree, that's not a big deal. Like it's not central to what it is to be a Christian, is to have this like covenantal relationship with Christ. Bible doesn't say anything about Christmas trees, no problem. So you can forbid it because it's religious, and it's okay to ask someone to give it up because it's cultural. So A, we don't know what that is. B, the assumption here is that things that are cultural are somehow less important maybe than things that are religious, is embedded in that, right? That like your religion is important and your culture isn't. I mean, who here feels like their culture isn't important? If you've traveled at all and you're just sort of realize that as much fun as it is, you get tired, right? Because you're constantly navigating different ways. Culture is hugely important. It's not, and it's also value laden, right? Like there's the argument that religion is value laden and culture is value laden. Think about how different models for how you're supposed to treat your parents, right? Think about cultures that have extended family networks that feel maybe really repressive to Americans who are used to being able to call their own shots. And those cultures think there's something so horribly lonely about American life, right? That's an indication that different cultures have different values.
I think a lot of the culture stuff, I'm sorry to jump in for just a second.
Go ahead.
A lot of the culture stuff is also emotional attachment. What you're raised with. It's things you have positive memories associated with and loving feelings, and you want to pass that experience on to your kids. And so it's people sometimes treat this as if it's a rational calculus of, which identity are we choosing, and we're going to be consistent and promote these values. But sometimes it's also just emotional attachment. I mean, we find that with people who are dyed-in-the-wool secular humanists who still feel a pull to recite a traditional prayer at the memorial time because this is what their parent or grandparent would have wanted them to do, and it's the words they're familiar with and the rhythm they know. It's ironically a cultural approach to a religious text.
Well, and so think about it this way. I interviewed multiple couples in which the secular atheist Jew who was determined that their kids would go to Hebrew school said, I don't understand why usually she wants a Christmas tree. She doesn't believe in Jesus. And so you would see that a lot, right? You would see that sort of double, like, you know, which are we going with a lot? And, you know.
Well, sometimes in marriages, you pick whatever argument might work.
Right. Well, I mean, that's also true, right? Like there's a lot of that going on. What are the sort of human relationship dynamics?
Right. You know, one of the other questions that came up in my mind is people who are raising their kids as both versus raising them as mostly neither. You know, what makes Sue Katz Miller's community, and she actually spoke at our congregation some years ago after her first book, Being Both, came out, is that they're really actively doing both, and not just in December. And not just, I mean, they're doing it all the way through the calendar year as part of a regular Sunday school experience, regular weekly services. I mean, it's a very different dynamic than many people who describe themselves as raising their kids both is Christmas, Hanukkah, and Easter Passover at home and, you know, minimal time. And often Hanukkah whenever Christmas is, no matter when Hanukkah shows up in the calendar. And so it's not quite neither, but it's not both in the sort of a full, you know, full-fledged religious identity. And these families sometimes will say to me, well, we do the Jewish high holidays, Hanukkah and Passover, because they think of those as the most important Jewish holidays, which they are the most observed American Jewish holidays, in part because of the surrounding culture and everything else. And so I think part of the challenge is there's so much diversity in the interfaith family universe of the choices families make, the kind of communities they find, their personal values, where their compromises are, that in some ways there is no perfect fit or one answer that's going to meet every interfaith family's need.
Well, and I think, you know, one of the things so two thoughts. I spoke at a Reform congregation last week. Yeah, like the second night of Hanukkah, so last week. And what I said is, like, I've got data and stories about how interfaith families celebrate and why they make the choices that they do. That's a very different thing from telling you what you should do. What you should do is you should take my data and my explanation for why people do the things they do. And then you should take your values. And, you know, it's a real question. Do you want the strong remnant? Or do you want sort of a broad tent, understanding that both of those are going to affect what your Judaism or your Presbyterianism or whatever it is going to look like when you're done? And, you know, so that's one thing, right? Like, I really think, like, you need to have values that are informing how you make your choices. What I would like to see is for every group of people trying to decide how to deal with interfaith families to interact from a place of values rather than from a place of fear. Now, that doesn't mean that every single interfaith family is going to be comfortable in every single religious community, nor should they be, right? Because the religious communities should have particularity. There are going to be people where they are interfaith and they are deeply God-fearing is the word that's coming to mind, but not actually the word I want to use, people.
God intoxicated.
They might be happier, right? Like, I have this friend from college, she's Muslim, and she married an atheist Jew. And she said to him, here's the deal. We can be a Muslim family and we can be atheists, my customs, your atheism, or we are joining like the most observant Reform synagogue we can find. She wanted her kids, she wanted to share God with her kids, or she wanted to share customs with her kids. You know, and they then didn't have kids, so it never came to pass, right? But you know, you can imagine people who would be comfortable here would not be comfortable in the Catholic Church. That's fair, that's fine. But I would like everybody to be deciding how to deal with those people from a place of values. And I'm not going to share all of those values, God knows I've never met a Catholic who shares all of the values of the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah, I also remind couples when I marry them that whatever decisions you make now about your theoretical, hypothetical kids may change when you have a real life baby in front of you, you know, and you think having a pet is preparing you, and it's not. You have no idea what you're getting into. But the point is that there are always surprises that come up, and you have to be flexible and build on a relationship of sharing and not just tolerance, but celebrating the difference in the identity of the other person, as opposed to that old joke. I think it was a stage play. I love you. You're perfect. Now change.
It was a stage play. I saw it. So the saddest story that I heard in the course of my field work, and I didn't write about this in the book, and I didn't write about it because I had sort of IRB permission to be in the place that I was in. So Institutional Review Board permission to be there. And someone shared a story knowing that I was there, and then afterwards told me that it was okay with her if I told the story, but she never wanted her ex-husband to pick up a book and totally blindsided see this story that she had shared. They had lost a child to leukemia. And they had agreed that the child would be raised Jewish. The child was raised Jewish. Her husband wasn't. She didn't think of him as a believing Christian. And they were like at his deathbed. And it was her husband all of a sudden realized that he could not let his child die unbaptized, that he didn't really believe in hell, but both he couldn't let his mother believe that her beloved grandchild was in hell. And also he wasn't sure he didn't believe in hell. Like he had never had to think about it. His parents were both alive. He hadn't really thought about it. Like his grandparents had been like, he had been told as a small child that his grandparents were in heaven. That was good with him. This was the first time he just didn't. And she said, of course I had my child baptized. Of course I did. I would have done anything he needed in that moment. And, you know, their marriage didn't survive, as marriages in which people lose children have very high failure rates, but that isn't what happened, right? That isn't what caused their marriage to fail. And she hadn't been married to him for 20 years, and she would have clocked anyone who suggested she had done the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had the conversation with a couple on the positive end of that when they were pregnant with the first child and were trying to make the decision about baptism or not. And the daughter of the minister all of a sudden felt compelled to explore baptism for the kid. And the Jewish partner, I asked her, what do you think about John here? What's going to happen to him? And her response was, well, I was always taught that at the end of days, he'd get a choice and I'd hope he'd make the right choice. I said, John, what do you think? He said, well, I have a different perspective. So in the end, they were able to work it out, and we had a nice conversation, but they were also torn with that what if disaster scenario. But when you get to ultimate questions, sometimes there are competing truth claims. And as much as we try to paper over those or use, kumbaya, everybody sings together kind of language, sometimes push comes to shove and there are differences. I did want to make sure we have time for people to ask their questions, comments, whatever. So if you do have something you'd like to add or to ask to Dr. Mehta, please unmute yourself and jump in.
Well, I'd like to say, I've got a lot of stuff, but I'm going to parse it out. I want to go back to your comment that Chrismukkah was never, isn't a term used in people's homes, non-commercially. So we have a daughter who I like to say bicultural instead of interfaith. I struggle whether secular humanist Judaism is a religion, unless I go to the third definition in Webster. So we always talked about a bicultural family. And we raised our child, I'm going to say mainly Jewish, because my husband, I don't know, was raised Presbyterian, but it didn't take. And, but we said to our in-laws, if you want her to know about your culture and your religion, that will be up to you to teach her. And they did, very respectfully, knowing what we believed. But my child got to high school and decided that she was going to throw a Chrismukkah party. And we threw Chrismukkah parties for up to 50 people for at least, well, through college. So at least and further 10, 12 years. And what did Chrismukkah mean? It meant latkes, some cookies, right, Christmas cookies, and whatever other food Callie chose to experiment with that year. And people would talk about coming to the Chrismukkah party. And I didn't ever realize that it wasn't a term that was used culturally, not commercially. I'm trying to make that distinction.
So I think that absolutely, like that's what happens. People will throw sort of a Chrismukkah party. And you'll see that in terms of, and that happens in people's homes in the way that you describe. I grew up, my mom used to throw this big Christmas Eve party. She had a friend who was from who had gotten divorced from her Cuban husband. So she was all alone on Christmas Eve, which is like a bigger holiday for Cubans. I mean, Epiphany's the thing, but like, and so it was a party for her. And so it was us, any relatives we had in town, her, and any other friends who were free. So all of the Jewish friends at this Christmas Eve party, right? People absolutely throw those parties. I think that what I'm kind of trying to get at is there is this assumption that everyone who does both is doing this weird consumer frenzy, or not weird, but like this sort of capitalist party that you see in the media, rather than kind of joyous seasonal parties in which they bring all of the fun to the table. That's more what I mean, that it gets painted as sort of a boogeyman.
Or also that it's sort of a crass materialism where the kid wants to do both just to get more loot, and the parents are trying to buy the kids' affection by giving them more and bigger gifts. And it's projecting people's stereotypes onto families that are making conscious and often values-based choices.
Yeah, and that was really what I was trying to get at.
I'm going to jump in and say something to you. I'm Leora's mother. I grew up in Israel to American parents who were incredibly Jewish and incredibly secular.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got married to Leora's father in 1951, he came from the Sephardic community, and that was like marrying somebody out of my religion. So my family originates from Eastern Europe, more or less, that's what we know. So this is 1951. Things have changed all over, not just in Israel, but all over. Yet, try and get married in Israel, and it has to be a religious marriage, unless you go to Cyprus.
Mm-hmm.
So things do change, and attitudes do. You know, when Leora got married to Tom, and I got some flack from my family and the more Orthodox members of my family in Israel, my answer was, he's an incredible mensch, and that's all that matters. So, you know, things do change. There's much less hostilities unless you go to Israel.
My favorite family story, my dad is from India. My dad was from India. And my mom my great-grandfather was he had 11 sisters and like 2 brothers. And so my mom brought my dad to visit one of the great aunts, probably in the, I don't know, like in the early 70s. And a neighbor kept saying, like trying to figure out what the family thought. And finally the great aunt said to her, "Effie, you're not in your own home," which was a way of saying, shut up, like we're good. So it's sort of the upstate New York Presbyterian way of saying he's a mensch.
Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, we're talking about Christmas, which has kind of an extended celebration.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were talking about Easter dinner, but most of the other religious aspects of things, Jewish things, are in the home. I mean, even your wake is in a hall, but your shiva is at home. Your Shabbat services, Passover, a lot of the Jewish things are not necessarily in the synagogue. Mm-hmm. They're in the home. So you have a lot of opportunity to have cultural things. Other things are more church oriented and outside the home. It makes it a little bit more difficult to balance those things.
You know, that was part of the reform movement's argument for why interfaith couples should be Jewish, was that the Christian partner could leave and just go be Christian at church, that you didn't need to be Christian at home. And, you know, I think my Unitarian relatives would really take umbrage at that. They think that they're Unitarian every single day, every single decision they make, right, is deeply, deeply inflected by, I mean, my mother cried when she saw the version of Little Women, actually the version of Little Women that just came out last year, but also the one with Winona Ryder, because they're so clearly a Unitarian family every single day, right? But also, one of my closest colleagues when I was getting my PhD is a Baptist minister, and being Christian is braided into their everyday, right? They pray before every meal. They pray before bed. They talk about making their choices, and very much, and like not in a kitschy, ironic way, in terms of what would Jesus do. They tried to hide the 2016 election from their children. They like just figured like this could never happen, right? Like he would lose, their kids would never need to know there was hate like this in the world. And about 3 weeks before the election, their then 7-year-old announced to the table that she didn't think Donald Trump knew Jesus. She had like an embodied or a sense of what it meant to know Jesus. So like, I think in some ways it's not quite fair to Christianity to think it doesn't happen in the home. You know, like I think in some ways it's true that it doesn't have, like you don't keep kosher, but then again, neither do something like 85% of American Jews.
I often say that just because it's episodic doesn't mean it's not important. You know, just because it only happens at a funeral or it only happens in December doesn't mean that that moment, the identity expression isn't significant and worth respect and inclusion.
We went to a family funeral recently. My cousin's grandmother died, and they were Presbyterian. And it said, like right there in the order of service, we're going to say the Lord's Prayer and we're going to say debtors. Every single, like my cousins were also raised Unitarian. Their dad's a minister. I'm Jewish. I haven't been in a Unitarian church more than once or twice a year in 15 years. Where they don't, by the way, say the Lord's Prayer, ever. All of us said it wrong. Why did we all say it wrong? Because we are all from New England and have spent lots of time at funeral and wedding masses.
Yeah.
Turns out we have the Lord's Prayer memorized and are Catholic.
Yeah, I know the Paul's letter to the Corinthians from all the weddings I've done. Mm-hmm. Lori?
Yeah, I wanted to just give you another perspective. Mm-hmm. I have kind of a checkered background. My parents were married in 1944 in the midst of World War II, just before my dad was sent over to France. And he was a nice Jewish Russian Jew from Brooklyn, and my mother was a Protestant Swedish girl from Portland, Oregon, and they met. It's a long story. I won't give you the story, but World War II brought them together in Oregon State University. And my grandparents were extremely upset because the only son married a shiksa, and they tried to make her convert, and she went through a conversion ceremony, but that's the last Jewish thing she ever did in her life. And there was always this tension. But the way I grew up, first of all, I would say for Christianity, my mother's Christianity was expressed through family ties. And so having the Christmas tree or having an Easter, and I grew up with a Christmas tree. But my aunt, who lived 2 blocks away, who was my father's first cousin, everything we did the dreidel and we did all the, all the stuff for Hanukkah. And my grandmother lived the next town over. This is all on Long Island. So I got a very heavy dose of Jewish culture at the same time. But what's interesting, but we were raised as ethical culturists. Because that's my parents didn't want to do any religion, so they went that direction, just secular humanism. But my siblings, I have 2 siblings. My brother who lives in Boulder, is blonde, blue-eyed, and you would never know he had a Jewish background at all, and he doesn't identify at all with Judaism. My sister married a nice Jewish doctor from Brooklyn, and she also does meticulously identify as Jewish. And her kids, one's married a gal named Mehta, actually, Sheetal. But I, on the other hand, have identified much more as Jewish, as Adam knows, and I've joined the congregation recently. But my wife is Pennsylvania Dutch. So, I mean, it's a very confusing, but I think that for me, it's very cultural. You know, the Jewish thing, I mean, I have the menorah, we have a Christmas tree downstairs. I would feel very weird if I didn't have one or the other to have as part of my life. We always had a party on Christmas Day. You know, most of the people that came over were Jewish because that's the neighborhood I lived in, but it was really I never heard the word Chrismukkah before, but in a sense, that's what we were doing, I think, you know. Anyway, it's just, but in 1944, it was tough to be an interfaith marriage, you know, especially with immigrants who came from Russia and fled the pogroms. They didn't understand.
Yeah, I mean, when I started this research, I was visiting a friend of mine. His name is Matt Sherman, and he was considering the priesthood. He decided in the end that he wanted kids, and so he's Catholic, and so he didn't become a priest. But his mother told a story about meeting his dad and really liking his dad, but his dad's last name was Sherman, and what if he was Jewish? And you know, here's this woman who sent 5 children through parochial school, and her comment was, back then that would have been a big deal, but now it would be nothing. And you know, all of her kids did marry Catholics except for the one who is gay, who is partnered with a Catholic, and has a secular, who I believe they got married in the Episcopal Church and then felt really attached to the Episcopal Church, right? But she so here's this woman who is so devout. She taught in a parochial school for her entire career, saying now it wouldn't be a big deal, you know. And I realized in retrospect, she was actually sort of feeling, she was like uncertain what my relationship was with her son, and was trying to really signal. And I thought he was going to be a priest, so like he was really a friend. But you know, again, that was her fear with this cute guy that she met, was that it was going to destroy everything if they ended up together. And yeah, not a big deal now. But I think
my dad was concerned.
The way that you're describing things, you would fit perfectly with when I said, like, there are all of these academic definitions of religion. Yeah. Professor Orsi, who was a colleague of yours, his definition is really what, in some ways, what you are talking about, right? And I think when people are asked to give up their Christmas tree, they're also being asked to give up their grandmother's ornaments.
Right. Yeah. It just as an adjunct, and I'll get off. But my father's middle name was Herman, so it was Herman Schiller, and he was afraid it sounded too Jewish when he met my mother at Oregon State, where there weren't any Jews except the guys in the army who came, you know, from New York. So he said her name was Hamilton. So, and she was afraid. She'd never met a Jew before. And she was afraid that he had a wife and 2 kids back in New York, and it was just, you know, a con job, but it worked out.
When my dad died, I was living in Western Pennsylvania, and I had to drive over an hour to say Hadash, and tended not to, actually, but was driven insane by this because it's such a German area that there were like Jewish names all over the place. There was like a Wexler dry cleaner and a Stoltz law firm, and I'm from suburban New York. And it actually took me a while to figure out how it could be that these were the names surrounding me, and yet I had to drive an hour to say Hadash.
You know, you talk about interracial. When you first mentioned it from years ago, the first thing that came to my mind was this huge movie. Does anyone remember Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Where I believe it was a white woman who brought, was it Sidney Poitier or something?
Yeah, and Spencer Tracy.
Well, I don't remember who was in it. And how shocked, now this was before I was married, and I've been married almost 49 years, how shocked my parents were that this was happening. And of course, by the time they finished with the evening, I knew I wouldn't even think of doing something like that, because like you said, disowned. I could see my parents disowning me for an interracial. I don't know how they would react if Steve wasn't Jewish, but an interracial marriage, oh my goodness, I can't imagine my parents accepting this in a million years. And I remember it was such a big movie and how much, there was so much controversy about it. And I don't remember when this movie was made, but it had to be over 50 years ago.
You know, it's interesting. So I'm in my early 40s. And so many of my friends, many of my lesbian and gay friends came out sort of in or right after college, right? Now I think kids tend to come out, depending on where they live, of course, in junior high or high school. But for my friends, it was like college or right after college. And I have a friend who when I was working on this book, told me this story. He's a historian, and we went to college together. And he was asking me, he had a friend who decided to come out to his parents by bringing home this serious boyfriend. And the parents, the parents flipped out, but the parents didn't flip out that he had brought home a guy. The parents flipped out that he had brought home someone who wasn't Jewish. And so the question was, if you're serious, will he convert? And so this actually prompted an article that I wrote with another colleague about, like, how did that happen? How did it happen that it's totally fine to bring home a same-sex partner, but it's not okay to bring home a not the same religion partner? Like, how did that come to be? But that's what I was thinking as you were sort of saying, like, here's the interracial piece. What would the interfaith piece look like?
I'll give you one other example from my family history. My mother grew up in a very left, very progressive, I'm talking not even reform, like Jewish socialist background, in favor of racial justice and progress in the 40s and 50s. But then she brought home a date who was African-American. This must have been in the early 60s. And her grandmother read her the Riot Act. And she said, what about all these values? And her grandmother said, there are only two Black men you could ever possibly marry. One is if he's president of the United States, and the other is Harry Belafonte. Those were the two that were allowed.
Yeah, when I worked at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, I guess when I interviewed for the job, they had a Hava Nagila exhibit that just the sound of Harry Belafonte rang through the entire thing.
Yeah, Michelle.
I wanted to say, when you were describing kind of the positioning and what was going on with the reform movement in the 80s, it was really interesting. My parents got married in 79, and my mom then converted over a period of time because they had like a Jewish wedding when I was like 5-ish. There's pictures of us. And my mom had to give up everything, give up the Christmas tree. And like, she still talks about that being so hard for her. Like, I remember we couldn't have a Christmas tree. And then at some point we finally convinced them we could, but it was hidden in the basement of the house. Like, so it was like nobody would see it and all this stuff. So
they got stockings.
We always got stockings for Christmas, and we got Easter baskets, but we were very clearly Jewish. Just with, it was never confusing, but it was just interesting to hear you talk about.
In the archive at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, there is a letter written by some man to Alexander Schindler, under whose auspices the Jewish Outreach Initiative, which was like the reform movement's attempt to make interfaith families feel welcome. And he was writing about how they were told they could like go to his in-laws for Christmas, but his wife, I don't know if she was like from a military family or if she was European, but her parents were in Europe and they couldn't afford to go back. They were teachers, so if they went in the summer, they could stay for like a month, but if they could afford to go once a year, it didn't make sense to go at Christmas. She was really depressed, and they had promised not to have a tree. And so he's pleading with Schindler to say that they can have a tree. And part of his argument is that it's cruel. And part of his argument is that they're the only house on the entirely Jewish block that doesn't have a Christmas tree. And so it seems extra cruel. So that came to mind as you were talking. The other thing that came to mind is that there are people I talked to a lot of rabbis while I was writing this book. And one of the things that became really clear is that younger rabbis had basically no problem with the Christmas tree. And many of the older rabbis had changed their minds over the course of their career. And part of what, and obviously I'm talking, these are largely Reform and Reconstructionist rabbis that I'm talking to, because they are people who are talking about how their policy on what you had to promise to do weddings, right? So the conservative movement doesn't do weddings. And as Adam pointed out, humanistic Jews are really tiny. So demographically didn't come up in the cities where I was doing work. And one of the things that has changed is that as the Reform movement has really stepped up the amount of Jewish observance that is sort of common in terms of what people's home lives look like, they've gotten less nervous about things like Christmas. So if people are having sort of meaningful and engaged synagogue existences, and or they're like lighting Shabbat candles at least a couple of times a month, people are like less freaked out by the idea that there might be a tree for no more than 4 weeks of the year. And so that's an interesting trend, but that was like the prime moment for being really anxious about that.
Yeah, Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, one other interesting thing is that it's not even necessarily mixed culture or mixed religion. My in-laws are both first-generation Americans. My father's first generation, my mother's second generation. They were mostly they were raised religiously, but mostly cultural Jews, and so all of our families are have no intercultural mixing at that point. Yet Susan and I separately were raised of having Christmas stockings, even though we didn't have a Christmas tree. We were taken to see Santa Claus. We looked for Easter eggs on Easter, but it was still so I could see how culturally, it's not that difficult to take the next step, even for the Jewish part of the couple to have the tree. My mother always wanted one. She wouldn't have one in the house, but eventually when my mom and dad had a store, she always had a tree in the store, so she was able to decorate it the way she wanted, even though she never had one in her house.
You know, two things as you were talking. One is that, as one of my colleagues likes to say whenever we're sort of presenting on a panel together, she always says, all marriages are interfaith marriages. She's, you know, I don't remember what her and her husband's respective backgrounds are, but they're both Jewish, but they're from very different sort of both family histories and movements, right? But the other thing, Leora mentioned saying bicultural rather than interfaith, and I wanted to say a little bit about why I say interfaith. And the answer is Google, right? Like that's the term that is easily Googleable. I think left to myself would have gone either with bicultural. I mean, the other reason I went with interfaith is because I talk in the book a lot about the uses of the term culture and religion and how they are not stable. So it seemed like a bad idea to put one of them in the title, but I might have gone with bicultural for exactly the reasons. Like one of the things that I was most interested in are people who are like, who don't think that they're religiously different from each other because they're not religious. And then they get married and they start realizing some of the things that we were talking about earlier, right? Like, oh my God, what if, I don't really believe that you go to hell if you're not baptized, but what if I'm wrong, right? Like they have those moments. Or there's a moment in the 1980s Emmy award-winning television show 30-something, in which the husband is like, I always liked having a tree. I liked having a tree with my wife, but now we've got this baby, and I think, what does it mean if I have a tree? I see my grandfather rising up out of the grave to have another heart attack, right? Like, so things like that come up. And so like people realize later that maybe there are sticking points or questions, and I was curious about that. But I also interviewed the Unitarian interfaith families that I interviewed really hate the term interfaith. And they hate it because they will say we have two religious heritages, but one shared faith. Like what they're doing in a UU congregation is that is the common ground. So they're not interfaith, but they are coming to that from two religions. And so that was another point of view. It's like there isn't a perfect term that fits and works for everybody. And so in the end, I had no like theoretical skin in the word faith. So I wasn't going to be like fighting with my own title. And it is the thing that will pull up on a Google search. So it was like a marketing ploy.
I sometimes refer to intercultural partnerships where neither one is religious as interfaithless. But that has its own challenges too. Anyways, yeah, Leora, one last thing, and then we'll start to wrap up.
So just to say about religion, I was raised by a father who thought that religion was a dirty word. And on my mother's side, her father was essentially, religion is the opiate of the people for most of his life until the end when he started going to synagogue. I found it interesting that when we were trying to get married in 1985, and I grew up with a Christmas tree from this religion is a dirty word guy, okay? He insisted on the Christmas tree.
They're very pretty.
They're wonderful, and I have had one every year of my life, and I love them. I found it interesting that when we were trying to get married in 1985, rabbis refused to marry us, and mainly I was talking to Reform. I can't afford to have my congregation know that I would marry you. And about Dan Friedman, he'd marry anybody, including someone to an orangutan, was what I was told by one rabbi. One rabbi asked me, "What's wrong? Are you pregnant?" That was the Rebbitzin, actually. And then there was the rabbi who said, "I will marry you, but it'll have to be quietly in my study and none of my congregation can know." When we finally found a rabbi who would marry us, he had long talks with us. And I found it interesting that though he was willing to do a marriage of a Jew and a non-Jew, he was insistent that we raise our child Jewish, and he pointed out no Christmas tree. So on the one hand, he was willing to do an interfaith marriage, but on the other hand, the Christmas, he's going against policy at the time, but the Christmas tree was a no-no. I found that very interesting.
One rabbi I talked to had what I thought was a really coherent way of thinking about this, although I don't know, again, I'm bringing this up because I think it's interesting, not necessarily, I'm not a rabbi, but this is not probably what I would say. But his argument was, you should really think about the life that you want to live as being represented in your wedding. And so what does it mean to have me be the officiant versus a number of other choices that you could make? And so his argument was, this is in some ways a moment when, and this is part of where I probably personally disagree with him. This is not like, you shouldn't start your married life by appeasing your parents. I figure a wedding is all about appeasing people. Like, I've seen Monsoon Wedding, I know how this works. But his argument was, this is a moment when you should really be sort of asserting who you are. So he didn't have the Christmas tree or not, but he was like, if you're not basically planning on being a Jewish home, like, and maybe a Jewish home that does a bunch of other stuff, but if you're not planning on being a Jewish home, it doesn't make sense to choose me. If you're planning on being basically a secular home that does both, it probably makes sense to have a justice of the peace. If you're planning on being, if you're planning on sort of doing both and you're not sure what you're going to do, the Unitarians will marry anyone. Or, if you think you might be liberal Christians, it maybe makes sense to ask, like a Congregationalist or liberal Presbyterian PCUSA minister, right? Like, it should be a moment that reflects. And that would be how he would bring it to the table. And I asked how this played, and he said it often played pretty well because, he would sort of say, like, if you have children, and he would say what Adam is saying about, like, your decisions now may or may not be your decisions when it actually happens. But he would be like, if you're not planning on raising your kids in a Jewish religious community, it maybe doesn't make sense to start with me. And I thought it was interesting because he was framing it as a moment of asserting who you are together to the families, which is one way of thinking about what's going on at a wedding. It's not, in my experience, what is going on at weddings, but like, he has more experience than I do because he has officiated at many more weddings than I have been to.
Well, there's a big difference between the wedding and the marriage. Those are two different phenomena. But
right, and that's sort of my argument, and his was the wedding should actually be emblematic of the marriage.
I don't rate my success rate on how the marriages do. I'm only in charge of the weddings. And Michelle was going to jump in, and she offers a different perspective, having been married by a humanistic rabbi 20 years after Leora's wedding.
Right. So what I was going to say with all the different layers of this conversation is that I grew up in a Reformed congregation. And then when I brought home Ben, who is a secular Christian, otherwise known as nothing, according to him, the community response was ridiculous. Like, I couldn't believe how upset people were. And then the rabbi was so condescending, so concerned about the children, so concerned about if you'd convert. And that's when we went and found Adam. And we were like, this is what we need. We need the culture and like reason and like none of the other stuff. So that's how we got there.
Yeah. Based on what's going on in the corner of the screen, the children seem fine, but maybe a little sleepy. Are you sleepy? Hi.
I just want to make one comment. Judaism does not require marriage to be done by a rabbi. All you need is two male witnesses to one another, and it's the male saying to the woman, I hereby marry you according to the law of Moses and Israel. And there are two male witnesses, and you are married.
That would work in the state of Pennsylvania.
I'm not talking about administratively at all. I'm just talking about in terms of the Jewish, quotes, religion, culture, whatever you want to call it.
No, I know. I'm just sort of joking because in Pennsylvania, where the laws were written with a real attention to what Quaker weddings involve, you don't need an officiant. But I don't know. Adam, do you know how many, if any of the other 50 states?
Very few. I know in California you can register for a day, but now with the internet, you can join the Church of Dudism or the Universal Life Church. I know somebody ordained their cat with the Universal Life Church and got the certificate for them. So there's no limit. And this is, I think, one of the challenging things for me, imagining I have a career going out another 25, 30 years and want some continuity to that. And for our congregation as a congregation, you know, that question of, is it too late? Has the momentum already started towards distancing from communities, creating your own communities, having independent bar bat mitzvahs, having your friends ordained online to do the wedding for you. I mean, I'm doing a fraction of the weddings that Rabbi Friedman, our emeritus rabbi, did when he was the only one in Chicago who would do them. He did 3,500 weddings in his rabbinic career. You know, and it was like, 40 years active and then another 10 since he retired. But I'm going to get nowhere near that. I might get to, I'm at, I think about 350 right now after 20 years, just because there are more rabbis willing to do them. And there are plenty of people who don't even bother going to a rabbi anymore when they want to get married. The institutions have just lost the cachet they used to have. And what I loved about the book, to bring it back to the book and sort of to wrap it up a little bit, is you're always looking at the bigger picture. What does interfaith marriage and the way these people are defining their identities say about what religious identity is? What is the way they're creating community and connecting or not with the community say about what it means to be part of a Jewish community? What are the boundaries the communities are drawing, saying about who they are and what they think they can handle and what they're afraid of? You know, you bring the wonderful perspective of not an activist within the Jewish community like myself or or other.
I'm just not an activist.
No, not in that area. I know of other areas, seeing you on Facebook, I know of other areas you're very
robust conversation about abortion, but
right. That's maybe the next book.
Actually, the next book is birth control.
So, there you go. But the point is that what I found really enlightening about the book is how many of those bigger picture questions you were opening up, using the phenomenon of interfaith marriage, but as sort of the canary in the coal mine of what are some of the real meaty core issues that Jewish communities have to grapple with. You know, if they include more people by conversion, does that decrease the ethnicity side of Jewish identity? How do you be both inclusive to interfaith families and maintain a distinct Jewish ethnic identity for those people who identify that way? these are questions every community has to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things that are really important, right? Like one is that having interfaith families in a community, if you're doing it in a way that is at all ethical or responsible, changes the character of the communities. Because one of the things that you can do with a community that is an ethnic enclave is you can grouch. I'm actually sort of illustrating my point, right? Like one of the things that people talk about is like you need to drop the level of Yiddish in communities to make them inclusive. And so what that was, right, was me like trying to think of the English word that I needed, and it's grouch. I also one that wasn't a swear, but like,
well, kvetch isn't a swear.
I was thinking of other English words that I could
okay,
use.
Fine.
Right. So my immediate translation in my head was maybe not, since
yes,
we're now a multi-generational group. But to grouch about like the majority, you can't do that and be welcoming to interfaith families, right? And that does change the nature of the community. And for some people, that is a loss. For other people, like it's actually better, but for some people, it's a loss. The other thing is, this often gets framed in terms of assimilation, but I think, Adam, that the questions that you're asking about the nature of religious life are really important, because the Presbyterians are not doing well. Unless something really dramatic changes in the religious landscape, I've got a bunch of friends where, then this is the Presbyterian Church USA. The PCA is a different kettle of fish. But the Presbyterian Church USA, unless something really big shifts in the next century, they're not thinking they're going to be around. Like many Presbyterian sort of seminary professors and who are often clergy, like they're not making a good case for why you would need to do that. Judaism, in part because of that ethnic component, and also because it does have a different set of animating values than the Christian mainstream. Even a super liberal Judaism and a super liberal Christianity have different animating values a lot of the time, has actually like better odds in some ways. You know, and I think that's interesting because it gets framed in terms of like, oh dear, Jews don't want to be different. They want to celebrate Christmas. Oh man, we can't compete against the forces. No, Jews are actually doing better than the Presbyterians.
Yeah.
Methodist churches are closing at a mad, crazy, wicked, fast pace.
Yeah. You know, one of my colleagues, Denise Handlarski, wrote a book where she used the same phrase I used 10 years before, but came up with it on her own. So we both get credit for it. And that in response to intermarriage or response to the challenges Jews face more broadly, we should be using less oi and more joy. And the more positive and meaningful experiences we create, the more people will want to seek those for their families and carry them on in their own version of culture, tradition, and religion.
And that's where there's an edge for Jews over the Presbyterians, for instance. I don't know why I picked the Presbyterians. I could have picked the Methodists. Because the Jewish moments of joy do often look a little bit different than the mainstream American ones, whereas the mainstream Christian ones do get folded more neatly into secular society. You know, you get the same questions of like, would people be happier with better sort of communal structures? And that's a question. I don't know the answer to it, but it's a question. But the distinctive cultural moments blend in better.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Dr. Mehta, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to hear from you, to chat with you, to have the chance to interact with you. I really appreciated it. Thank you very much.